While I imagine some of you absolutely love your plodding base miles in all weathers, most of us, myself included, will be turning to the turbo to get our winter training in. That's why today I'm going to be looking at some of the best trainers that come in around that £500 mark. Now, while they may not be hitting the prices of some of those top-end models, the performance doesn't leave you wanting for much more. They are incredibly capable units. So for the past few months, we've been putting these trainers through their paces to work out which one's best. But which trainers are we going to be looking at? Well, we've got the Zwift Hub, we've got the Jet Black Volt, we've got the Wahoo Kickr Core, we've got the Tacx Flux S, and we've got the Elite Zumo. Now, if you like the look of any of these trainers, then I have left a link to them down in the description. So without further ado, let's jump in. The Elite Zumo spec sheet totally represents what a well-rounded trainer is. The second cheapest trainer on test, it's also the lightest and has the lightest flywheel. The claimed accuracy is joint worst at ±3%, and the maximum resistance is the lowest at 1350 watts. The slope simulation also stands out in being second shallowest at 12%. Now, most of these points are immaterial. The max gradient of 12% is still more than enough for all your low cadence, high power interval needs. It's just that you'll need to be pushing a slightly larger gear than with the Tacx Neo 2T or a Wahoo Kickr. Plus, if you haven't fiddled with the default realism settings in Zwift, then the maximum gradient of 22% will be reduced to 11% and thus will fall within the trainer's capabilities. The maximum resistance of 1350 watts is worth a little more consideration than that of other turbos on this test, as it's not a number that's unfeasible for amateur riders to top. But as an amateur rider who's never once topped 1300 watts, I still haven't been able to test its limits. With that out of the way, let's get on to the more important bits first. We'll start with the ride feel. Despite having the lightest flywheel on test, the riding sensation was really smooth, much better than the Jet Black Volt 2, which we'll get onto later. Riding around the sand and sequoias map on Zwift, it responded to the gradient changes really quickly and proportionally with barely any lag. So far, so good, but the flip side is that when riding in erg mode and doing a session such as 20x40s or 10x1 minutes, anything where there's a big power differential, you can quite easily end up in something of a death spiral of ever increasing resistance as you struggle to spin your legs up to speed. This is something that's true of all trainers to some extent, and it's generally a good idea to spin your legs up to cadence before entering those intervals to give yourself a bit of a buffer. But this was a particular issue for the Zumo, and it was also a problem for the higher end Diretto that we tested last year. So it seems as though it's more of a general problem for Elite. In all, the Zumo is super portable thanks to its carry handle, foldable legs, and general lightweight build. At the same time, it's very stable thanks to its wide footprint, and the resistance is very nicely controlled and feels very smooth despite the smaller flywheel. It's let down by its propensity to death spiral when doing interval sessions with large power differentials in erg mode, an issue shared by its big brother, the Diretto. And it's also let down by the low resistance when riding without the erg mode or any realism, spinning out at about 250 watts, an issue shared by its little brother, the Tuo. Let's get this out of the way first. The Jet Black Volt 2 does look pretty similar to the Wahoo Kickr Core, coming in at the same price, the same maximum gradient simulation, and the same maximum watts, and you might be starting to raise your eyebrows. But on closer inspection, the Jet Black Volt 2 is actually quite distinct to the Kickr Core. The first clue is in the weight at 15.4 kilos versus the 18 kilos for the Wahoo. So there's obviously quite a bit that's different between them. Part of that is down to the heft of the flywheel, coming in at 4.7 kilos for the Jet Black compared to the 5.4 kilos for the Wahoo. Plus, the housing of the flywheel is quite different as well. The Jet Black has more plastic housing, its legs are oval rather than circular, and the front bar is fixed in place. However, the performance is quite different as well. On steep virtual climbs when riding at a low cadence in erg mode, the resistance felt distinctly choppy. It was like pushing through treacle between 2 and 4 o'clock on the pedal stroke, with the resistance easing up significantly, almost slipping past after that. It made for a pretty jarring ride feel. However, at higher speeds and wattages, that issue does seem to minimize somewhat. First off, this is a really great turbo trainer, but that's what makes this one a little frustrating, as it's so close to being the obvious go-to for pretty much everyone. Meaning, there will be some people for whom it's not quite the right model. With the heaviest flywheel on test, it's also the heaviest trainer overall. Couple that with its unique footprint and it's an incredibly stable platform, potentially even slightly more stable than the Tacx Neo 2T, which one of my colleagues tested last year. The resistance and ride feel is very close to that of its big brother, with changes in gradient being fast, smooth, and the resistance remaining steady even when climbing at a low speed and cadence. The erg mode coped well with even large differences in power, ramping the resistance quickly whilst also not crushing my cadence the way the Zumo did. Another point of contrast is that when riding without the erg mode or any virtual gradients, I was in a comfortable position on the cassette, not cross-chaining with the bigger sprockets, but also not running out of the small ones. In terms of just the virtual ride feel and stability of the turbo, this was the best on test, and it's even better than some of the turbos that come in at a higher price point. Having swept up on the fundamentals, the question is whether it's a viable alternative to turbos that are more expensive, and unfortunately, here there are some hurdles that it does fall down on. First, the accuracy. Rated at ±3%, it's the same as the Zumo, but this leaves it under the ±2% cutoff for higher level Zwift racing. For most people, this is immaterial. Most people don't race on Zwift, and for most people, even an accuracy of ±3% would be a big step up from the estimated values of the platform's Z power. But if this is a consideration for you, it's worth being aware of. Similarly, for challenges such as virtual Everesting, the rules stipulate that you need realism set to 100%. If you're planning on using outdoor Zwift for your attempt, then you're going to fall foul of the rules, as the maximum gradient there is 14%. Yes, these are minor gripes, and for many people, they wouldn't matter. It's just because the Tacx Flux S is so good in all other aspects that it's worth starting to split hairs and drill into this level of detail. The other consideration is that it's not a trainer for moving about or stowing away. The legs don't fold, and it really is incredibly heavy. The Wahoo Kickr Core and the Tacx Flux S line up for a particularly interesting contrast. It's almost like a Venn diagram, but where the two circles have been pushed together, a great deal of overlap, and each only having a sliver of what the other doesn't. Starting with the fundamentals, because again, the Kickr Core executes these so well that we can get to the more hair-splitting details later. First off, I'd argue that the ride feel is, in some aspects, actually better than the top-end Kickr V5, which I tested last year. Bear in mind, it's now been surpassed by the V6. So how can this be? Well, my assumption is that it's down to the weight of the flywheels. With the Kickr V5, it felt like there was a great deal of inertia to spin up, more so than the sensation out on the road. The closest feeling to that is of a spin bike and the huge fixed gear flywheels those are equipped with. True, the Tacx Neo 2T boasts of its electromagnetic flywheel of up to 125 kilos, but it's simulating that all the time, and in my opinion, it has more of a road feel than that of a Kickr V5. Coming back to the Kickr Core though, with the flywheel being 5.4 kilos compared to the 7.3 kilos of the V5, the sensations of acceleration feel just that little bit more natural. Although, if you're a heavier rider, you may well find the opposite. In terms of the response of changes to gradient and large differentials of power in erg mode, the resistance changed smoothly and quickly, whilst also not having propensity to death spiral, forcing you into an ever lower cadence, much like its Kickr big brother. As mentioned, the Kickr Core hits the point that the Tacx Flux S has missed. With a power accuracy of ±2%, this is a cheaper entry point to the higher end of indoor racing, should your training take you there. And with a maximum gradient of 16%, you'll be able to cut your virtual Everesting teeth on the outdoor Zwift. It's also an easier trainer to move around than the Flux S and takes up less space, especially with that foldable front leg. However, there are points which do let it down in comparison to the Flux S. First is the stability. These 2-bar designs are much less stable than 3-leg versions, and the Flux is particularly solid. Then there's the price. £100 more might not seem too much when choosing between bikes, but here, that's a sizable portion of the value of the turbos. The Zwift Hub provides a brilliant way for anyone to get into smart training. The unit can boast a lot of impressive features, however, it's the value of the product which is certainly the standout. The ride sensation was smooth and measured, with only the occasional choppy feeling at the lower cadences. I found the flywheel did spin up fairly quickly, however, at the other end, I didn't feel as though I was spinning the trainer out at the higher power numbers. The erg mode was smooth and very quick to react to in-game gradient changes. Currently, you do have to perform a spin down calibration. However, Zwift is working to include a software upgrade, which means it'll be automatic. One thing I did notice was slow to change with the power and cadence numbers in-game compared to the other trainers using the same connection, i.e. AMP+. Stability was always going to be slightly compromised given the layout of the legs. However, I only found it to be an issue when I was giving it the beans out of the saddle. Speaking of big efforts, the sound of the trainer is actually relatively quiet, and I would say is on par with the other trainers on this list. It is much of a muchness. The downsides of this trainer are the lack of carry handle. There's no obvious place to pick it up from, and thus means it's rather unwieldy when moving it around. The weight is definitely better than others on this list, which is a positive. However, the lack of folding legs means it's not the most convenient thing to store or transport. Overall, when you consider the features that are packed into this trainer, along with the simple setup and sheer value the trainer provides, it's a bit of a no-brainer for anyone looking to start their indoor training adventure. So to wrap up, the Tacx Flux S is the best turbo for the vast majority of people. It has by far and away the best ride feel, and in terms of actually using it as a turbo, these are the qualities that are going to be what you're most attuned to and will find most notable. It's very smooth and it's very stable. The limitations of the Flux S are that it's quite awkward to move around, and it doesn't simulate gradients high enough for virtual Everesting or have power accuracy good enough for virtual racing. The Wahoo Kickr Core answers all of these points, but it is let down by the high price. It's £100 more, and the fact that the stability and ride feel aren't on the same level as the Tacx Flux S is a real shame, because really, this is quite exceptional in those areas. The Elite Zumo, the Jet Black Volt 2 and the Zwift Hub, I would say, are actually all much of a muchness. The Elite Zumo delivers an excellent platform with its legs that can be folded away, the carry handle, the general lightness of the weight of the product, and the really good ride feel. And the price is pretty reasonable too. The downside is the tendency to death spiral when in erg mode and the lowest resistance when free riding. The Jet Black Volt is expensive, and the stats, while good, aren't good enough for Zwift racing. Mainly, it's let down by the choppy feeling when riding at lowish cadences, and power when climbing moderate gradients. The Zwift Hub is very similar in stats to the Jet Black Volt 2, but it is much cheaper. I think this means that you can forgive the slightly choppy ride feel when you consider how much value the trainer provides. For those wanting bang for buck, the Zwift Hub makes the most sense. But for those looking for the best trainer in this price bracket, then go for the Tacx Flux S. You are very unlikely to be disappointed. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I've left links for all of these trainers down in the description box below. What I want to know from you guys though is, out of these trainers, which one would you go for? If you enjoyed the video, drop it a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and I'll see you again very soon. Down to my knees, down to my feet. Oh, is there a bin back there? Ah! Kobe. Particularly interesting.